You're listening to Player Development, a channel focused on the intersection of sports and character growth. Please like and subscribe to support the stories being shared, the growth of our listeners, and to stay up to date with our latest content.
I'm Peter McHenry. I'm an economics professor at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. I grew up all over the place as a kid in a Navy family, but ended up at Vanderbilt to get a bachelor's degree in economics, and then I studied at Yale, got a PhD there, and William & Mary's been my first real job. I guess I've been here about 12 years. I'm a labor economist, so I study work and pay. And while I don't study athletes' work in my research all that much, certainly labor economists do study how athletes do what they do, how they get compensated, and so I get to teach about some of those issues. And I've been getting more into sports these days because I'm coaching my little kids at soccer, and that's a really joyful thing these days. I'm looking forward to the fall season.
All right, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your perspective on economics and how they relate to sports. So we're going to be talking a little bit about some recent events and also some very major sports franchises, talking about like the Olympics, major sports leagues. So if it does ethicality play at all into financial decisions when you're talking about organizations dealing with billions of dollars at a time?
Sure, yeah, I think ethics are very important when making big decisions and totally consistent with what economists say about things and how economists think about decisions. Economics is just the study of how people and societies allocate scarce resources, how people make decisions, how people behave strategically in interacting with one another, and how all those decisions get aggregated into social outcomes, like how much price of a cup of coffee is, you know? So if ethics are motivating that human behavior, if ethics are motivating how people make decisions, then ethics are very important for economics. And so we just take them as given, and we understand what are the moral understandings, the motivations of people, and let's take that as given in doing the economic analysis. So I see these things as overlapping and very much consistent with one another. Yeah.
So depending on the priorities of the decision makers, ethics can definitely be consistent with decision making.
Absolutely. I mean, why don't people cheat more than they do? The punishment for cheating in some situations is actually kind of mild and kind of small, but we observe that people don't cheat as much as you might expect, maybe on their taxes or in a game.
Sure.
And why is that? Well, evidently people have a cost, an internal cost of cheating, and that discourages it and makes it less common than it is. And so we just take that cost as given and do the analysis and just observe and see how things work out.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, let me transition to our first topic. This is pretty recent, talking about the Olympics. In May of 2021, the New York Times reported that there was a poll that showed that 83% of Japanese citizens did not want to host the Olympics. And there's been growing conversation about the economic cost of hosting an Olympics. So the AP News reports that the final official cost for hosting the Olympics in Tokyo was $15.4 billion, with $8.7 billion coming from Japanese taxpayers. And so I wanted to present this quote to you and kind of get your thoughts on it. So this is from Wolfgang Manig, who's a sports economist. He writes that the Olympics do not generate any significant positive effect on national income, employment, tax income, tourism, etc. So agree or disagree, what are your thoughts on the state of things?
I agree. Economists and others have been studying the effect of hosting the Olympics on outcomes in the local area for quite a while. And we've also studied the effect of having the Super Bowl in your city, World Cup games, things like that. And there are benefits to some people in the local area. There are costs to other people in the local area. On average, the things tend to wash out. And you'll see boosters of the Olympics say, oh, we should host the Olympics. It'd be great for our city.
Yeah.
That's boosterism, and it's not really consistent with the evidence that we've seen. Who wins from having the Olympics? If you own a hotel.
Sure.
I think there's good evidence that the Olympics come into a city like London, hotel prices go up, and if your business is selling hotel room nights, then you made more money.
That makes sense.
Yeah, good. The Olympics, they build a lot of things, right? Build a new stadium for this, build the Olympic Village to house the athletes. So if you're a construction firm, you make a lot of money when the Olympics comes in town. So who's asking companies to estimate the economic impact to be a positive number? Construction firms, hotel firms, things like that. People, firms like that. But other folks pay costs. So I read recently that when London hosted the Summer Olympics, some theater shows shut down. They just didn't have shows for some time, or not as many shows as they normally would, because Olympic sports fans were flooding London. That came at the cost of other folks who would otherwise have come to watch the theater.
I see.
So theater revenues dipped some in the short run. They bounced back. And so there are benefits, but there are also costs. And the costs probably outweigh the benefits in terms of taxpayer money, fiscal things. I mean, when you build a stadium that gets used for a few weeks and then hardly at all for the next 8 years, it's pretty wasteful, and it's not a great use of resources.
Okay. So short term, there may be some benefits for certain sectors of the economy, and long term, it seems like we're looking at more loss than gain.
Possibly. I think some cities weather it pretty well. I mean, was it a disaster for Atlanta? Was it a disaster for London? No, not at all.
Right.
They did fine. They hosted it well. It turned out fine. It was a pretty expensive way to have a big party. Are parties a bad idea? No, they're just costly. And so if the people in Atlanta really loved having the Olympics, then okay. But I think it's telling that you ask people in Tokyo, do you want to have this? And they say, well, no, overwhelmingly. Well, that should be informative, hopefully, in making decisions. Of course, COVID changed how people thought about having Olympics this year, and reasonably so. But I think when you ask citizens about the Olympics separate from pandemic issues, you often see people not really wanting them. Boston, for example, was thinking about bidding to host the Olympics, and the local folks in Boston said, no, we don't want that. And so they stopped.
Okay. And a lot has been made about the International Olympic Committee itself and how they're making a lot of revenue off of, broadcast rights, the bids that cities put in to host the Olympics. And in the end, out of the $15.4 billion, that's the official tally for the cost of the Tokyo Olympics, it's reported that the International Olympic Committee contributed $1.3 billion, so about 1/15, I guess, of the cost. Is there any way that we can realistically change this model to make it more palatable for cities to be able to host?
So you're thinking about having the International Olympic Committee provide more of the subsidy to
that's one of
use their largesse
that's
to
one
support
of
the cities a little bit?
Suggestions, I guess, that's being discussed.
Right.
Given that they make all of the TV revenue and broadcast revenue off of it, and the city just reaps whatever, like you said, tourists might bring in, which I'm sure the disparity was huge in a COVID year Olympics.
Right. Well, that was different. Hopefully in future Olympics that won't be as much of an issue.
Right.
But I don't know the details of the contracts between the IOC and the city, but it seems to me to be a negotiation. These things aren't fixed. They're not necessarily always the same. You could imagine a world where the IOC says, hey, we'll pay half the costs. We'll build these stadiums for you or fund them. But they don't. Why don't they? Because they don't have to, right? It's a negotiation. And the IOC wants to pay as little as possible and keep as much as possible. The city the same way. So I think how is this going to change? I think cities could be a little bit less desperate to host the Olympics in the first place.
Yeah.
The IOC could look around and say, well, it's kind of hard to recruit cities to do this. We need to pay more of the bill. And so I think as things go forward, and you think of, in economics, we would call it maybe an equilibrium. As we move toward a new equilibrium where the IOC has to pay a little bit more to entice cities to play ball. At the moment, I guess cities are still willing to pay a lot for an Olympics.
Yeah.
But you do see things changing over time. Boston decided not to. Other cities are deciding, no, that's not really for us. And so you end up, my understanding is that when, an upcoming one, they basically had China or Kazakhstan, is that right? Those were the two options?
I don't remember, but yeah, I've heard that there are very few cities looking to actually host now.
Right, yeah. So I think in the future, the IOC, if they want to get the Olympics in Boston, would have to offer a sweeter deal. And maybe the citizens would say, oh, okay, well, if they're going to pay for all the infrastructure, then we could enjoy that big party, and that would be good.
I see. So as the discourse changes around how the Olympics is viewed, how the cost is viewed, then we might move toward, kind of naturally towards a state where cities don't have to be the ones shouldering all of the burden.
I think we could, although you see the Olympics shifting a little bit toward less democratic places.
Yeah.
So if China's government is not really responsive to the desires of the citizens, their distaste for taxes or whatever, Russia is not as democratic as we'd like to see it, then you have the Sochi Olympics, you have Olympics in other places that are less responsive to their citizens.
Yeah.
And as long as there are places like that, then maybe there's not as much heat on the IOC to make the deal sweeter.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, there are a lot of factors that go into the way that things might move. It's not just one particular trend or one particular
Oh, right.
factor.
Everything's way more complicated than I can ever understand, sure. But it's good to peel back the onion or just look at a little bit more complexity.
All right. Well, let me move on to... Let's go from global to specifically to the U.S. So this is talking about the NCAA, and you being a professor at William & Mary, I'm sure have some familiarity with how that whole system might work. But July 1st of this year, the NCAA started allowing athletes to make money off of their name, image, and likeness. So currently, there's no federal law in place regarding this. So there's no standard across the country, but states are putting laws in place. So just giving some background context numerically, according to CNBC in 2019, I guess that would have been the last pre-COVID March Madness tournament, generated $1 billion plus in TV ad spending. And TV networks pay around $800 million for the rights to broadcast that, in addition to an anticipated 47 million people placing bets on the tournament, whether officially or unofficially. And ESPN currently pays $600 million each year to broadcast NCAA postseason football. And so prior to the rule change, NCAA athletes were not allowed to receive any compensation outside of their scholarship.
Yeah.
So what's the impact of this rule change, and I guess in your opinion, is this moving in the right direction?
In my opinion, yes, it is moving in the right direction. I think the college sports environment has been on an unsustainable path for a long time. As you mentioned, there's a lot of money in it.
Sure.
And the people who are the content providers, the athletes themselves, not allowed to share much in the benefits that they're generating, and that I think has struck people as odd for quite a while, and just not good, right? This is just not the way that things ought to be, And so I'm a labor economist. I study work and pay. And so one of the places where I tend to focus is the argument about what is a college athlete relationship with the college.
Okay.
Under U.S. law and understanding, regulatory understanding, currently and forever, scholarship athletes under the NCAA have been primarily students. And they're basically operating as students in a club, and they get a scholarship to help them go to school, but it's not a business sort of relationship. And most importantly, they're not employees of the college.
Right.
If they were employees of the college, they would be, of course, entitled to many rights.
Sure.
Minimum wages, workplace safety laws, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, inspections of the workplace to make sure that it's safe. We have a lot of laws, federal laws and also state laws, that try to protect the rights of workers to be treated fairly and well, compensated appropriately, not exploited or oppressed. And college athletes don't get any of that.
Right.
And that might work fine in some settings, but it's pretty clear that in a lot of programs, a lot of athletes act as employees and really ought to be called employees of the university. They're compensated with scholarships.
Yeah.
If they don't do the work, they lose their scholarship. Their coaches pretty much control how they do their work. And they spend a lot of time at it.
Yeah.
And more time, at least in season, more time on sports than on academics. Academics clearly a secondary thing for many scholarship athletes in many places. So are they employees of the university? I think yes. And I get that partly from a National Labor Relations Board judge who ruled about 6 years ago that in particular Northwestern University scholarship football players were employees of the university. Now that was a regional judge. That case got appealed by Northwestern University, who wanted to say, no, these are students, we don't have to pay them. The question was whether they could have a labor union. They wanted to unionize, right? You can't unionize if you're not an employee.
Okay.
So the judge said, well, they can unionize because they're employees. And he was the first to say that they were employees in an official capacity. But the appeal went up to the National Labor Relations Board. And the National Labor Relations Board basically decided not to rule on the case. So they didn't say that judge is wrong.
Right.
They just said, we something like declined to assert authority in this case. And that just kept the status quo, which was scholarship athletes are primarily students, not employees. And I was very disappointed, I remember, and I like to teach about it, because they didn't argue the case. They didn't say, this is why we don't think they're employees. They just said, which in my mind was not a great outcome. But I think over time, since then, even more and more, we've been just moving in this direction where people say there's so much money, students aren't sharing in it at all.
Right.
They're basically employees of the college. The student the academic part, I mean, obviously I have a lot of athletes in my class. Many of them are excellent students. I love having them in class. But in season, that's a secondary thing for them. And they're really primarily athletes, even at William & Mary. And so, at Duke basketball, Alabama football, the sport is the top thing. And so I think compensating them makes some sense. My understanding is that the NCAA probably wants to allow its members to compensate students just enough to take the heat off so that they don't have to go all the way.
Sure.
And get to the point where scholarship athletes are employees. Because that would make college sports quite expensive. From the college's perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think changes would be made.
Okay.
If the government's ruled that, the federal government in particular ruled that athletes at college were employees.
Okay. Yeah. So now, I guess if athletes are not considered employees yet at this point, but they can make money off of their name, image, and likeness, that, I've seen there are some athletes already that have started monetizing their Instagram feeds for, local businesses and endorsements, things like that. How can schools coexist and or support athletes now that they are students, as well as, I guess you could call them business owners, like they're self-employed at this point?
They're entrepreneurs. My understanding is that change, that monetizing Instagram feeds, making money off of your likeness, shouldn't have a big effect on the colleges themselves, I think. My understanding is that relatively small number of students will make much money doing that. That doesn't directly cost the college any money. It just allows the student to make more money. If anything, it might be easier to recruit athletes, because now, in addition to scholarship and the joy of the competition, you can say, hey, and you can make money, I guess, advertising for the local car dealer or whatever. I read into that rule a little bit. I don't know all the details, but I'm a little nervous about the implementation of this. My understanding is that you can make money helping a local car dealer sell cars, but not if the local car dealer is a booster for your college or something. And I think, how is that going to work?
Yeah, so there could potentially be a lot of conflicts of interest and of rules.
A lot of conflicts. There are rules that seem very difficult to enforce. So the way you write these rules is very important, and I'm not sure that they were written in a way that's sustainable. But I think allowing students to make some money in that way is a step in the right direction. I don't think it will have a major impact on college sports or the colleges. When colleges have to start compensating the players, paying them the minimum wage, overtime pay, things like that, that would change a lot. I think Alabama football, they're going to do fine. There's so much revenue, they can pay all the players. Maybe they'll trim the roster a little bit, I guess. I'm assuming the coaches will make less money to rebalance a little bit. I don't think that's going to change the coaches' lifestyles all that much, to go from really big to a little bit less compensation. But, of course, there are other sports that have a lot less revenue.
Right.
And a college just won't be able to sustain a situation where you're paying a wage to players on a team where ticket revenue is measured maybe in the tens of thousands of dollars, not the millions of dollars a season. So I think that would I'm guessing one of two things. We'd need to change the way sports are set up so that they really operate more like student-run clubs. If the coaches aren't in charge of the way, if the school is not in charge of the way the student does the work, then you could argue that the student is not an employee.
Right.
So you could just change things to something that looks more like a club and not have to compensate, because those aren't employees, right? It would give the students a lot more freedom to do the sport how they want, and it would look very different, but maybe that would be a way to sustain it. On the other hand, of course, if you do have the rowing team is employees of the university, and maybe rowing at your school doesn't make a lot of revenue, I think some of those teams would probably need to be cut.
Yeah, and I think as you talk about that brings up some questions about equity, because I'm sure, and we'll address this in the next topic too, but that generally, men's sports are going to be better attended than women's sports. And I'm sure there are exceptions, of course.
Yeah, but on average,
on average, and like you said, there are some more well-attended sports than others. So if the NCAA were to move towards like an employee-employer model, how might that impact, like you were talking about, the less popular sports?
Well, they wouldn't be very sustainable from a financial perspective. A lot of colleges find them not very sustainable now. They would be a lot less sustainable if you have to pay hourly wages to the athletes, for example. So I think it would just be very hard for some colleges to continue to have these sports. And so you drop some. How does Title IX regulation influence that? Right. You got to maintain a balance. This is where I don't feel comfortable at all speculating much because I don't know the details, but I wonder if Title IX would need to be reconsidered in a world where this really is a business part of the enterprise, right? I don't know if I just don't know if the regulation is written in such a way that that makes a lot of sense. Of course, equity would still be a valued and important part of the way we'd want colleges to operate, and so maybe a lot of it stays. But you have to think about how compensation plays into the fairness part, which I think is in there somewhere about scholarship equity and stuff. But it would probably need to be reconsidered.
Moving on to our final topic, and probably one of the touchiest topics, talking about pay equity between men and women's sports. So just like with the other topics, I'll start with a couple of numbers here, and then I'll ask for your comments. So among some major sports, this is from Adelphi University, and these numbers are as of 2019. In terms of basketball, the average male was compensated in the NBA $8 million a year, compared to women who were paid $75,000 a year. In soccer, and this is American soccer, men were paid an average of $400,000 a year, and women $35,000 a year. And in baseball, men were paid about $4 million a year versus $6,000 a year. And out of the highest paid athletes in 2019, and this is according to Forbes, Messi, Ronaldo, Neymar, all soccer players, all paid upwards of $100 million a year. So this is including endorsements, contracts, things like that. Women, all tennis players, Serena Williams, $29 million a year, Naomi Osaka, $24 million a year, and Angelique Kerber, $12 million a year. So what do you make of these statistics, and if change is needed, how does that happen?
Yeah, I think the statistics are informative and very intriguing. These are the outcomes of markets, and primarily this money is coming from the provision of entertainment, right? These are entertainers.
Sure.
The money is all coming from people who want to watch television. So you could watch a comedy on Netflix, or you could watch sports, and also ticket revenue and things like that, right? So this is an entertainment market, and you have superstars who earn lots and lots and lots of money. A lot of other people make less, and so if you looked at singers, actors and actresses, you'd have a similar kind of distribution with Messi earning the most, Nicole Kidman or whoever it is these days, Tom Hanks, everybody wants to watch, right? Making a heck of a lot, and then your average actor making less. And then you note that in a lot of sports, women on average make less than men, and this is something that is the outcome of a market. I think in broad terms, oversimplifying a bit, male superstar athletes attract more attention and more consumers than female athletes on average, right? Evidently in tennis, women are doing super well, not so much in other sports. And so is that a problem? I think it's a great question. I think the issue would be then with consumers, and would we rather live in a world where consumers are willing to pay as much to watch women play sports as men play sports? And so I would go to a deeper level than the decisions that the New England Patriots are making, or the decisions that Wimbledon is making, or whoever is involved in this. Let's look at the decisions that we as a society, or the consumers are making, and how those aggregate up, and this is the outcome that you see. So that's maybe unsatisfying, but another perspective you could take is this illegal?
Okay.
And it's not. And so then we could ask, is there a problem with that? Should we make such a thing illegal? And from a labor economics perspective, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have some people earn more at work than other people, right? Sure. If businesses have to pay everyone the same, it will be very difficult to make business run well. And if businesses don't run well, then we won't get the things that we want. You know, we won't be able to go to the grocery store and buy milk because it won't be a very well managed place. Probably if the manager isn't allowed to make more than other workers. And so there is inequality in labor markets, partly because some people have more experience than others, some people have higher levels of skill than others. And so there are legitimate reasons for some people to make more than others. There are also illegitimate reasons, discrimination based on sex, in our example, and that's illegal, right? Sure. And so what we want to do is think about, where do we see illegal discrimination, where there's not really another reason to explain this gap. It's explicitly or only about your gender, then that's illegal. And I think a lot of us would say, I would say, yeah, that's bad. Let's not have that in the economy. But just differences in average that can be explained with other things, uncomfortable, not necessarily the wrong thing, because the alternative could be worse. Sure. In some settings, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the most high-profile situation here that I think is very informative is the soccer teams in the U.S., right? The women's national team, men's national team. Sure. There's been some court activity going on. Yeah. And here I think things are very, very interesting, because you have a women's soccer players association bargaining for their contracts. And separately you have a men's players association bargaining for their contracts. Should we allow different players associations, one for women, one for men? I'm not sure, but we did, and we do, right? And everybody seems okay with that. So if they're allowed to bargain for different contracts, then I guess we ought to let them have different contracts, right? Okay. And see what deal they can get. And so I don't know if that's actually good, but people might be better off. Okay. With the ability to bargain for different things. And so here's a way that works out. These particular soccer players on the U.S. national teams get compensated in quite complex ways. Okay. They don't just get a salary. They get a salary. They also get paid per game that they play. Okay. They get insurance for medical treatment, things like that, right? They get childcare assistance, travel for their children to accompany them, childcare, like a nanny, right? Okay. And insurance against an injury. So guaranteed pay, even if you get injured, you'll still get pay, right? That's all part of the contract. Sure. And some of those elements could be more generous, some could be less generous. And so the women bargained and the men bargained, and the contracts look different. And in some of those areas, women got a better deal than men. They just got more compensation. They have a base salary. So if you're on the women's national team, you get a salary. The men's national team, the last contract they had, or maybe 2 contracts ago, one I was paying more attention to, there was no base salary. You got paid if you went to a camp. You got paid if you were in a game or on the roster for a game, I guess. But you didn't get paid unless you were playing, right? Okay. Now, the men got a bigger bonus if they won a game than the women got, right? So on some elements of that contract, men got compensated better than women. On others, women got compensated better than men. I would think, and the law is consistent with, you want to look at total compensation, right? Okay, sure. Overall, when you look at all of these factors and include everything, is the total compensation fair, between men and women? And when you really add all of these things up, I think there's an argument to be made that things look a lot more fair than just, men got higher bonuses than women get.
I see.
Because men didn't get guaranteed pay. And so the women's team bargained for insurance. We want a steady amount of pay. We want to face less risk.
Sure.
And that's a great thing. I think they benefit from that. I benefit from that. I buy insurance contracts, for life insurance and health insurance and things like that, disability insurance, and that's excellent. The men's national team didn't bargain for as many of those things, and to compensate, when they play, they make more money. When they don't play, they make nothing, right?
Right.
And so when you balance all these things out, I think it looks a lot closer to parity when you think about how U.S. Soccer, the single association, is treating its men's teams and its women's teams. The comparisons you have about, this men's league pays men this much, this women's league pays women that much, that's a harder comparison to make because they're totally different entities, right? It's almost like saying William and Mary pays its professors more or less than Virginia Commonwealth University pays its professors. Is it unfair that wages are higher in one university than another? I'm not sure. Maybe they ask more, maybe their health insurance benefits are less. Looking at the overall package, I think, is the way to go. Now, of course, the overall package for women's basketball players in the Women's Basketball Association, right, are overall going to be less than on average than the men's team. And is that okay? I don't think it's illegal.
Sure.
And it's up to us to decide whether we want to have a society that's structured that way.
Yeah. And I think one of the arguments that, as you were talking about, people paying tickets for, certain sporting events or people tuning in to watch certain events, I think there's a chicken and egg argument going on. And you already articulated one part of it is, well, if more people started wanting to watch women's sports, we'll say, just lump it all together between men's and women's sports. If more people wanted to watch women's sports, then that would bring more advertisers, that would bring more viewers to TV, and that would place more of a premium on advertising, things like that. So that brings in more money. And I think the flip side of that argument is if businesses invested more in bringing exposure to women's sports, if ESPN, for example, made primetime spots available for women's sports, then that would bring in that interest and that viewership. And so I guess there's a chicken or egg about whether it's the athlete's responsibility to bring in the viewers or the business side to make that a priority. What are your thoughts on that argument?
Yeah, I think it's a very good idea, and it's absolutely supported by evidence, I think, to a degree. So it's pretty clear that consumers respond to advertising. And social media or newspapers also can say, this is the way things are, you should be excited about this, and people respond by getting excited. But there's also evidence that newspapers just kind of respond to what people are wanting anyway. And so there is this positive correlation between what media will do, what an advertiser will do, what a newspaper will do, and what people are excited about or want to do. Who's causing whom to move? I think both, right? And so then, I would wonder, are fans really driving the bus and having the biggest effect on what gets shown on prime time? Or is ESPN really just in charge? And if they just decided by fiat, you know what, we're gonna put softball in all of the primetime slots. Is their viewership going to remain the same, and people are just going to get excited about softball all of a sudden? I'm a little skeptical of that myself. I think they're going to move the needle. I think more people will be excited about softball. Will it be just as much? I'm not really sure. So I think both things are in operation, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily equally important or one overwhelms the other. So I think you want to watch out for a very powerful player like ESPN exerting too much influence and steering public attention away from people in a way that's unfair or discriminatory, mean, however you want to think about it. But at the same time, if they really are responding to what people want, then I think it's a fair question to ask, is that so wrong?
Right.
Should we force people to watch something that they don't prefer? I don't know. Yeah, I think it's a really great ethical question that's related to economics. Is providing something to people a bad thing if what you're providing might be unfair or perpetuate some suboptimal allocation? Great question. Let's have coffee. Keep talking about it, because I don't really have the right answer, but I think we ought to be thinking about it. We ought to be concerned about it and keep a watch.
Yeah. And final point about pay between men and women. One number that I didn't bring up earlier is the comparison between male and female tennis players. So this, by all accounts, seems to be the closest to even across the gender gap, with men averaging $335,000 a year versus women averaging $283,000 a year. This is, again, in 2019. And so, like you heard earlier, also the top 3 earning women athletes in 2019 were also tennis players. So, compared to these other sports where there was a huge gap. And again, I don't know how familiar you are with tennis, but how do you think this might have happened in tennis versus other sports?
Right. I want to think harder about that. It's an excellent question. I know when we study things like this, we often look at different occupations, and so there's some good research on pharmacy. So it turns out that pharmacists are one of the professions with the most equality between men and women. If you look at surgeons, male surgeons make more than female surgeons. If you look at attorneys, male, but if you look at pharmacists, men and women make pretty similar pay. And so what's going on with pharmacy? And economist Claudia Golden is a fabulous economist who has studied this in particular. I think one of the ideas about pharmacy is that it's a job where, so on average, women who are professionals prefer, evidently, flexible hours more than men do. And you can be a pharmacist and have quite flexible hours. And you don't really lose anything in terms of productivity for your employer, and so your employer finds it in its best interest to provide sort of flexible hours. And so there's not really an extra burden or barrier for women on average, and they're obviously just as good as the men at being pharmacists, and so pay is somewhat equal. Other occupations, there are some barriers. If you want to work part-time for a little while or something like that, it's hard to get a job. You have to take time off, and then you get behind, and you lose some of the connections, and that's not great. Now, why is that? Is that necessarily the case for that occupation that has to be run that way? Maybe not. Maybe that's discriminatory itself, but it helps explain what's going on with pharmacy. So tennis, how is tennis different from other sports? I would use that analogy to think through it, and not really sure, but I would look for distinctive things about how tennis works and how consumers interact with tennis and the stardom, how many games they play, what the season is, or I guess the matches, right?
I'm not familiar with tennis either, so
okay.
I don't pretend to know the terminology. Right.
I think that's how I would think about it. Maybe people Oh, no, that's not. I was thinking about the relationship between playing a sport yourself and enjoying it as an entertainment.
Sure.
And I've always thought that there should be some sort of overlap there, but American football is so popular in the U.S. and I don't know many people at all who play football, or even played football as kids, right? All my friends played soccer and baseball. I played a little tennis, right? But I don't know. A lot of people play tennis.
Sure.
And maybe that makes tennis more exciting to watch. I don't know. Maybe you play tennis in a mixed gender place, and so maybe, I don't know, you pay more attention to both. I'm not sure. It's also possible that, as you're saying, TV, maybe, tennis associations have been intentional about promoting the women's game more than maybe other places have. I guess, are men and women kind of governed by the same group? I guess they would be, right?
I believe so, but I couldn't tell you 100%.
Okay. Well, I think that would potentially matter, because when you compare basketball for men and basketball for women, they're different leagues, right? They have different ownership structures, different things.
Right.
But for tennis, I think Wimbledon is run by somebody, and they run both men and women, right? So they would promote both in a similar kind of way, sell tickets in a similar way, they're playing in the same place at the same time. And so if you're excited about seeing women, you're also going to see men because they're playing about the same time. I wonder if that has something to do with it.
Could be. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts. I don't
know if they're any good.
No, I don't think anyone's going to solve this in a short conversation or even in the long conversations that people are having. But I appreciate your insights and helping to explain some of the stories behind some of these numbers that look very damning at first blush, and maybe having more of the story behind it helps to explain why things are structured this way and how we can responsibly and fairly move towards equity in all of these different issues.
Yeah, I think so. And being able to explain where this comes from doesn't mean that it's okay necessarily, but for me at least, it helps to understand, feel better about, well, I kind of see where that's coming from, and maybe it feels more okay. And if it doesn't, at least I understand it better, and I can know where it's going to try to make something different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, those are all the topics that I wanted to go over today. I'll kind of leave it to you for any final words, any parting ways that we can be thinking about some of these issues in sport moving forward.
Well, I'm an economist, and I've been speaking kind of from the perspective of an economist, and just want to give a pitch for economics. I think, my field, economics, is fabulous and matters for so many of these things. It's the study of how people make decisions to allocate scarce resources. You can't have this and that, so which one do you choose? That's basically economics, right? Yeah. And so we study sports for a lot of reasons. I guess I'll just give a short pitch for a field of economics, which is called game theory. And it's the study of strategic interactions of small numbers of people. And so when a soccer player is taking a penalty kick and deciding where to kick, right, left, center, that's a strategic decision, right? And so how should I think about this? If I always kick right, the goalie's going to learn that. The goalie's always going to go to her left, right, and block the kick every time. And so I need to think how to outsmart the goalie. And it turns out that the right thing to do, the right thing to do, right? Be unpredictable,
right?
And that's an outcome from an economic analysis. How to think about that. The goalie also is trying to figure out where to go.
Right.
If I always dive to my right, kicker's always going to go the other way, so I need to be unpredictable as well. And that's economics. And so it matters so much for sports and a lot of other things. And that's why I love teaching.